Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would like to put on record my disappointment at that speech from Maggie Barry, because this is actually a very positive piece of legislation. My colleague Ruth Dyson, who she chose to attack, was actually saying really good things about the process. And I also want to put on record my thanks to the Minister of Conservation for the collaborative way in which he's worked with parties for this piece of legislation. I don't think we needed that level of negativity in that speech on a bill that overwhelmingly we support. So I am disappointed by that, but I also want to thank Maggie Barry for the work she did as chair of that select committee. It's a committee that works extremely well together. It's a committee that's very, very busy, dealing with a lot of environmental legislation, and we had the privilege of travelling to Kaikoura to hear submissions on the bill, and what a beautiful part of the country. I had actually never been there before, and Ruth Dyson and I arrived at the airport and drove down the Kaikoura coast, and it was just incredible to be able to drive down and just see the seals right there on the side of the road, see the families out enjoying seeing such amazing wildlife so close up, and it really makes you think how lucky we are to live in such a beautiful country. And I was really privileged to be able to visit Kaikoura and to get a sense of what we were protecting. And to the Member of Parliament, Colin King, who's retiring, I'm sure he will enjoy spending a lot more time in a very beautiful part of the country, and I wish him well. As my colleague Ruth Dyson said, this was started by Chris Carter, and it's good to see it coming to a conclusion here. We have a marine reserve up just north of Gisborne where I live, and that marine reserve was contentious. There's a view of sometimes that marine reserves are locking up the ocean, which I always find odd, the idea that somehow fish aren't going to move in and out of a marine reserve. And there was concern around the impact on local fishing industries, because whenever we do this kind of legislation, you're dealing with a lot of existing rights. A lot of people who already use and make their livelihood often off that part of the ocean, and a fear that somehow this would limit their ability to do that. Well, the marine reserve up just north of Gisborne, I remember visiting it with Chris Carter when he was Minister of Conservation 4 years after it had been implemented, and there was a young woman there doing her PhD, and she was going out and putting cray pots down outside the marine reserve and inside the marine reserve and comparing, and only 4 years after the implementation of that particular marine reserve in a part of the country where our crayfish stock is severely depleted. It's a real issue. Outside the marine reserve, she was getting less than 1 kilogram of legal size cray. Inside the marine reserves, more than 30 kilograms of legal size cray. So just the regeneration that had occurred in the crayfish population in a very short period of time was incredible. And not only that, but we started to see fish stocks coming back to the east coast that we hadn't seen in a long time, because we had created a new environment for them. So it is a success story. I've personally seen the value of marine reserves up my way at home, and would like to see more of them. And I just want to mention one in particular, and that's the Kermadex. I think this is an absolute no-brainer that would have support right across the House. The Kermadex are an absolute treasure for this country, and I honestly expected that this would be, and maybe it's still to come, expected that this would be an announcement from the national government that they were going to put the Kermadex into a marine reserve, because to me, it just makes so much sense. I can't imagine why you would want to do anything around the Kermadex that would be limited by a marine reserve, for example, mining or anything else. So I do not know why we are not also passing legislation to put the Kermadex into a marine reserve. I certainly know that the Labor Party would strongly support that move, and I hope that the National Government don't have any plans for activities that would be contrary to the protection that a marine reserve would provide around that particularly important taonga for New Zealand. So, as I said, we had some concerns going to this legislation, and the chair of the committee who just took her seat mentioned Wellington Forest and Bird. I don't think they were being doctrinaire at all in raising concerns about the size of the marine reserve, the shape of the marine reserve, and the science of it. It wasn't doctrinaire, it wasn't being rigid, it wasn't sitting in Wellington and and dictating. They were simply raising very, very valid concerns that were backed up by science around why this marine reserve looks so different from other marine reserves. And I want to thank Kevin Hackwell from Forest and Bird, who gave that submission, for being a very passionate and a very positive defender of our environment in New Zealand. He does incredible work, and I would never ever say that just because he so passionately believes that we should have so much more of our marine environment and protection, and we agree with him, that he needs to be, degraded really, in a way in which he can't respond to. And then we went down to Kaikoura. And I have to say, Ruth Dyson and I were talking about it when we were travelling back from the Select Committee process. We were very moved by the submission process. And when we sat down and listened to all the various submitters, all of whom had come together, and Mark Solomon in particular actually, and heard their point of view and heard why the Marine Reserve had ended up being the way it was, why there was so little of the coastline actually in the Marine Reserve, I gained a real respect for their position, actually, and also gained a far greater understanding of the huge amount of work that had gone in this collaborative process to coming up with a solution that had the agreement of all stakeholders. And I think Kaikoura is probably one of the parts of the country where there is an exceptionally large number of existing interests that operate in the marine environment, so even more difficult to get everyone on board. So we heard from cray fishermen, from power fishermen, from the whale watch people, from local iwi, from local environmental groups, and all of them came together and positively supported this piece of legislation. And as my colleague Ruth Dyson said, I don't remember a marine reserve process that has ever been so positive, where all the stakeholders have come together and said, this is what we've agreed on. This is what we want, and we all are really, really passionate about this process and this marine reserve and the protections we're putting in place. And the very important message that they gave to us was, we will build on this marine reserve. So don't think that this is the end of a process and this is all that's going to happen in terms of marine protection in the Kaikoura area. We will build on this, and because of the relationships that we have developed through this process, because we've all listened, because we've taken all the existing interests into account and respected people's points of views and come up with a local solution, that process doesn't end here. The process will continue, and we will build on the protection that we have put in place. And I have to say, I was really impressed by that. And I really felt, as someone coming from the outside in, that we needed to respect the huge amount of work that had gone into that local process. And so even though we would have loved to have seen more, and even though we went in there with much greater concerns about how different this marine reserve was from usual and the different process that had been taken, I was genuinely very impressed by what came out of that process, and genuinely respect the wishes of the local people. There were one of the issues of concern, and we never actually got an answer to it, and I don't know whether the Minister has an answer to it, but what we found out was that in fact we had to make an amendment to the bill because it was actually 10 or 20 metres out. So the marine reserve boundaries that we had in the legislation were wrong by about 10 or 20 metres because apparently the Ministry for Primary Industries only takes GPS coordinates to 2 decimal places instead of 3. And so we said, well, why does the Ministry of Primary Industries only take coordinates to 2 decimal places instead of 3? And we were just told it's Ministry for Primary Industries policy. Well, for us that seemed very bizarre, that if you can take to 3 decimal places and actually get the marine reserve right, why would you not do that? Why would you only take to 2 decimal places and be 20 metres out?
What did they say? Because that's how they were.
And they said, well, that's how we've always done it. So we thought, okay, well, that's strange. We never really got a response. It's not the biggest issue in the world, but kind of it was one of those kind of gliding on moments, I think, where practicalities kind of went out the window a little bit. And I do want to acknowledge the officials and the very, very hard work they did on this piece of legislation. The other concern, Mr Speaker, which I will raise, is around the policing, because policing of marine reserves is also very important. The best fishing is on the boundaries of a marine reserve, so you need to make sure that marine reserves are being policed. I do have concerns about the capacity of DOCT to do that, given the cuts in funding that they've had, given the cuts in staff that they've had. A marine reserve and the boundaries are only as good, only worth anything if we know that they can be policed and that those boundaries aren't going to be breached. And the very department who we rely on to do that is under enormous financial pressure and has lost a number of staff, particularly in the region. So the policing of the marine reserve is one of my big concerns, but I congratulate the Minister on this bill. In fact, I congratulate Parliament on this bill, and I congratulate in particular the Guardians who did all the work in getting us to this point.
I call Gareth Hughes.
Kia ora, Mr Speaker. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou kia ora.